Let me tell you about a family that pulls in $23 billion in revenue every year, and they've done it for 128 years straight. But here's an even crazier part. If I said their name on the street right now, almost no one would recognize it. A family this powerful should be famous, right? But this one has made absolutely sure that they're not. And once you find out why, you'll understand that hiding is never the strange part. The strange part is what exactly they are hiding from everyone. Chapter 1. The most powerful family you've never heard of. Let's play a quick game. I'm going to list some things one single family built, and you tell me when you start feeling uncomfortable. The Hoover Dam in the Colorado River, the Channel Tunnel between England and France, the Washington, D.C. subway system, the world's first nuclear reactor to ever produce electricity back in 1949, the cleanup of 3 Mile Island after America's worst nuclear accident. They even had a hand in Chernobyl. They've worked on more than 25,000 projects in 160 countries since 1898. So basically, a huge chunk of the physical world you move through every day, including the roads, the power plants, and the airports, was assembled by this one family's company. Meet the Bechtels. And before we get into their secret empire, I need you to understand right away that their anonymity is not some accident or oversight. It is a deliberate, carefully engineered strategy, cultivated across 5 generations, specifically designed to keep them out of the spotlight that every other empire this size attracts. Think about it. Everyone knows the Rockefellers, the Waltons, the Rothschilds, but a private company pulling $23 billion a year, run by the same bloodline for 128 years straight? Silence, because they like it that way. But here's where it goes from impressive construction company to, wait, what? Because the Bechtels didn't just build the physical world. They quietly supplied the people who ran the United States government. At various points, a Bechtel man became the director of the CIA. Another became Secretary of State. Another became Secretary of Defense. They sent an envoy to personally pitch Saddam Hussein on a $2 billion pipeline. This is a construction company whose executives kept walking out the door and into the most powerful national security jobs in America. So the real question of this whole video isn't how they got rich. It's how a family got powerful enough that the line between their boardroom and the Pentagon basically stopped existing. And to understand that, you have to start with a Kansas farm boy, a team of mules, and $2.75 a day. Chapter 2. The Mule Team Millionaire. Picture rural Kansas in the 1890s, wheat fields to the horizon, and a young farmer named Warren Bechtel standing in one of them, doing the math on his own life and not liking the answer. Warren was born in 1872, 5th kid in a German-Swiss farming family, raised in a small Kansas town whose entire reason for existing was the railroad line running through it. And that detail matters, because Warren figured out something the men around him hadn't. He looked at the late 1800s economy and realized the real money wasn't in growing the wheat. It was in building the railroads that carried the wheat to market. The farmers were breaking their backs for pennies. The contractors grading the rail beds were standing at the front edge of American capitalism. Warren wanted to be on that edge. So in 1898, he made the bet that started everything. He and his wife Clara packed up, left the farm, and headed into the Oklahoma Territory, which wasn't even a state yet, just a rough federal frontier, with nothing but a team of mules and a willingness to do brutal labor for $2.75 a day. That's the founding fortune of a $23 billion empire, by the way. A guy, his wife, some mules, and pocket change. But Warren had 2 things his competitors didn't. First, an almost freakish gift for organizing huge teams of men and animals across nasty terrain. And second, this is the important one, he embraced new technology before anyone else dared to. In 1906, he bought himself a steam shovel, which back then was the cutting-edge machine, the iPhone of dirt moving. And in this one small act that tells you everything about the man, he painted his own name right on the side of it, W.A. Bechtel Company. He wasn't a guy with a mule team anymore. He was a brand. He understood the future was being built on rails, and the guy who showed up first with the best machine collected the check for the next 30 years. He was right. But the company with his name on it wouldn't become a true dynasty until the day his son took over a half-finished dam in the desert, with Warren's body still being shipped home from Russia. Speaking of betting on the best tool and letting it pay you back for decades, that's what pulled someone on our team to the Pulse R8 Smart Ring. It tracks your heart rate, your sleep, and your workouts straight from your finger. A week on a single charge, 100 days with the case, and it's fully waterproof. The part that got us was the price. Under $40, a fraction of what the big-name rings cost, because it comes direct instead of through the retailers that mark everything up. If you're watching on your TV, pause and scan the QR code on screen with your phone camera, or tap the first link in the description. Because the next bet, a half-finished desert dam during the Depression, is what turned a name into a dynasty. Chapter 3. The Dam That Built a Dynasty. Here's where the Bechtel story goes from successful regional contractor to legend. And it happens during the absolute worst possible time to attempt anything ambitious. The depths of the Great Depression. In 1931, the U.S. government put out bids for what they called Boulder Dam. You know it as the Hoover Dam. This was the single most ambitious construction project America had ever attempted. Full stop. The tallest dam in the world. The largest masonry structure built since the Great Pyramids of Egypt. We're talking a job so enormous, so financially terrifying, that no single company on Earth could absorb the risk of it during a global economic collapse. The price tag was nearly $49 million in 1931 money, close to $1 billion in today's dollars. So Warren did the smart thing. He didn't go it alone. He pulled together a consortium of West Coast contractors, including a guy named Henry Kaiser, who'd go on to become a legend himself, and they called the group 6 companies. Their winning bid was $48,890,995, calculated to come in just $24,000 under the government's own secret estimate. That's not luck. That's precision. They won. And then, mid-project, tragedy. In 1933, while touring construction sites in the Soviet Union, Warren Bechtel suddenly died at 61. Now imagine this scene. The most important construction project in the country is half-built, concrete is literally still being poured into the canyon walls, and the founder is dead in Moscow. The entire thing lands on the shoulders of his 33-year-old son, Stephen, who'd been a company officer for less than a decade. Most people would crumble. Stephen Bechtel did the opposite. He took command, and 6 companies finished the Hoover Dam in 5 years, 2 years ahead of schedule and under budget. After that triumph, Stephen made a declaration that became the family's mission statement for the next century. The company would build anything, for anybody, anywhere, no matter the size. And that "for anybody" part, that's the seed of everything that made the Bechtels both spectacularly rich and deeply, deeply controversial. Because the next anybody was going to be the U.S. military, and after that, a king. Chapter 4. How to Befriend a War and a Kingdom. World War II hit, and Stephen Bechtel saw not a catastrophe but the opportunity of a lifetime. And what he did with it set up the family's real superpower. He threw the company into the war effort and built it at a scale that's genuinely hard to picture. Through a shipbuilding operation in Los Angeles, Bechtel oversaw the construction of nearly 500 Liberty and Victory ships, the cargo vessels that were basically the bloodstream of the entire American war machine. At its peak, that one shipyard employed 40,000 people and, in 1942 alone, cranked out 111 ships. At one point, they built 20 ships in a single month. 20? They were stamping out massive ocean-going vessels like they were toasters. But here's the thing. The money from the war wasn't even the most valuable thing Stephen got out of it. The most valuable thing was a friendship. He'd partnered with a Berkeley buddy named John McCone, and McCone would go on to become, wait for it, the director of the CIA under Presidents Kennedy and Johnson. Sit with that. The business partner of the head of Bechtel became the head of the Central Intelligence Agency. That was the first time a Bechtel man walked into the absolute top of the U.S. government, and it established the template, the revolving door, that the family would run for the next 50 years. Expertise and relationships flowing both directions between the boardroom and the government, and nobody quite able to tell where the company ended and the state began. And then, in 1944, in a shipyard in the Bay Area, came the handshake that would define the family for 80 years. A Saudi prince named Faisal, who'd later become king, toured Bechtel's facilities and was deeply impressed by the sheer industrial muscle on display. He hired them for some infrastructure work. That one tour kicked off a partnership between an American family and an Arabian dynasty that would physically reshape an entire nation. Because Saudi Arabia was about to ask Bechtel to do something almost nobody on Earth could do: build a country from scratch. Chapter 5. The family that built Saudi Arabia. When people say Bechtel built Saudi Arabia, they think it's hype. It is not hype. It is almost an understatement. It started with oil. In 1950, Bechtel finished the Trans-Arabian Pipeline. They called it Tapline. And the numbers are staggering. They worked non-stop for 2 years, employing 20,000 laborers to lay over 1,000 miles of steel pipe straight across the desert, from the oil fields on the Persian Gulf all the way to the Mediterranean. When it was done, it was the largest pipeline of its kind in the world. And it wasn't just an engineering marvel. It tied the flow of Arabian oil to Western markets, helped rebuild post-war Europe, and bound American and Saudi interests together so tightly that, as one scholar put it, what was good for the oil company seemed to also be what was good for the United States. Bechtel was standing right at that intersection, physically building the connection. But the real jaw-dropper came later. In the mid-1970s, Saudi Arabia decided it wanted to stop being purely an oil exporter and build an entire industrial city. From absolutely nothing. The place was called Jubail, and when Bechtel started, it was a sleepy little fishing and pearl diving village on the coast. The kingdom basically handed Bechtel a stretch of empty desert and said, "Build us a city." So they did. By the time they were done, Jubail had become a 687-square-mile industrial megacomplex that today generates around 7% of Saudi Arabia's entire economy. At peak, they were moving 20,000 workers a month through it. A New York Times reporter trying to describe the scale of it in 1987 basically gave up and said, maybe something in the ancient world compared to it? Maybe. So picture where the family is now. They're building the largest industrial city on the planet. They're the dominant force in American nuclear plant construction. They've got 8 Saudi kings and roughly 8 American presidents in their contact list. But the most powerful thing the Bechtels had going in this era wasn't a project or a pipeline. It was their staff. Because in the early 1980s, the Bechtel boardroom was about to empty directly into the White House cabinet. And that's when the whole world started to notice. Chapter 6. The revolving door into the White House. Okay, this is the chapter where it gets genuinely wild, and it's the heart of why this family is so untouchable. In the 1970s, 2 men held top jobs at Bechtel. The first was George Shultz, a serious heavyweight who'd already been Secretary of Labor and Treasury, who joined Bechtel and rose to become president of the entire company, the number 2 guy. The second was Caspar Weinberger, who was serving as Bechtel's vice president and general counsel. So you've got these 2 enormously powerful executives running a private construction firm in San Francisco. Normal enough, right? 2 corporate guys. Watch what happens next. In 1982, President Reagan needed a Secretary of State, the chief diplomat of the entire United States. He picked George Shultz, straight out of the Bechtel presidency. And around the same time, Reagan needed a Secretary of Defense, the man who runs the Pentagon and the entire U.S. military. He picked Caspar Weinberger, also straight out of Bechtel. Let that fully land. Within months of each other, one single private construction company in San Francisco handed the U.S. government both the man running the State Department and the man running the Pentagon. The New York Times reported it in a tone that was basically stunned disbelief. And this wasn't even the whole roster. Remember, a Bechtel man had already run the CIA, a former CIA director was working as a Bechtel consultant, and a Bechtel executive was now Deputy Secretary of Energy. Time magazine ran an investigation in 1982 and concluded that Bechtel had probably done more to transform the landscape of America and the world than any other company of the century, while wrapping itself in a level of secrecy rivaled only by actual monarchies. And here's the part that should make the hair on your neck stand up. This was 1961, when McCone walked into the CIA, the exact same year President Eisenhower gave his famous farewell speech warning America about the dangers of the military-industrial complex, that cozy, dangerous merger of corporate interest and government power. Bechtel didn't just participate in that complex. They were, arguably, the single cleanest, most polished example of it that has ever existed. And we're about to see exactly what that looks like when it walks into a room with Saddam Hussein. Chapter 7. The Pipeline, Saddam, and Two Wars. Here's where all that quiet power becomes very, very visible and very uncomfortable. Back in the early 1980s, with the Iran-Iraq war raging, Bechtel wanted to build a $2 billion oil pipeline through Iraq. To pull it off, they needed Saddam Hussein's blessing. So who did the Reagan administration send to Baghdad to smooth things over? A special envoy named Donald Rumsfeld. Yes, that Donald Rumsfeld. On December 20th, 1983, Rumsfeld sat down with Saddam Hussein. And here's the detail that got declassified years later. According to a State Department cable, Rumsfeld barely mentioned the actual war he was officially there to discuss. What he talked about was the Bechtel pipeline. And the memo about that meeting? It was addressed to George Shultz, who was at that exact moment Secretary of State and a former president of Bechtel. So you've got a government envoy pitching a private company's pipeline to a dictator, reporting back to a Secretary of State who used to run that very company. The pipeline never actually got built, but the pattern was now sitting in the federal archives in black and white. Fast forward 2 decades to 2003 and the US invasion of Iraq, and the pattern repeats almost shamelessly. Right before the invasion, the Bechtel chairman gets appointed to a presidential council. George Shultz, now a Bechtel board member, is simultaneously chairing a pro-war advocacy group pushing to liberate Iraq. A Bechtel senior vice president is sitting on the Pentagon's Defense Policy Board. And then, surprise, when it's time to hand out the massive contracts to rebuild the Iraq that America just bombed, Bechtel lands one of the biggest, worth up to nearly $700 million, followed by another worth up to $1.8 billion. Anti-war protesters literally stormed Bechtel's headquarters. Critics published reports with titles like "Bechtel, Profiting from Destruction," making the obvious, brutal argument that the same people who used their influence to help start the war then collected the contracts to rebuild what the war destroyed. Whether you see that as genuine expertise serving the nation or as the ultimate insider racket, and honestly, reasonable people land on both sides. It's the clearest look we ever got at how the machine actually works. But running a machine that powerful comes with a price, and the bill came due in a Bolivian city and a Boston tunnel. Chapter 8. The bill comes due, and the empire rolls on. For all the cabinet seats in desert cities, the Bechtel model has a dark side, and 2 stories show exactly what it costs when it goes wrong. The first is Bolivia. In 1999, a Bechtel subsidiary won a 40-year contract to run the water system of Cochabamba, one of the poorest cities in the hemisphere. Within weeks, water rates shot up by an average of more than 50%. For families already barely scraping by, that meant impossible choices between water and food. The city exploded. It became known as the Cochabamba Water War. General strikes shut everything down, the government declared martial law, and in the chaos, soldiers killed an unarmed 17-year-old boy named Victor Hugo Daza. By 2000, Bechtel was forced out of the country entirely. They then had the nerve to file a $50 million claim against Bolivia, one of the poorest nations on Earth, before finally, after years of global outrage, dropping it for a token settlement of 30 cents. The second story is the Boston Big Dig, the most expensive highway project in U.S. history. It was supposed to cost $2.5 billion and take 7 years. It took 15 years and ballooned to over $14 billion. And in 2006, 12 tons of ceiling panels collapsed in a tunnel, crushing a woman in her car. After investigators found, managers had been warned the bolt system was failing. Bechtel and its partner eventually paid over $450 million to settle the claims. So how does a family survive Bolivia, Iraq, the Big Dig, 2 nuclear cleanups, and a whistleblower scandal, and just keep going? Simple. They're genuinely, world-beatingly good at building enormous things, and there are maybe a handful of entities on the planet that can actually do what they do at that scale. Today, the company is run by Brendan Bechtel, the great-great-grandson of Mule Team Warren, the 5th straight generation of the family to run it. He's got dual master's degrees from Stanford, talks the modern language of clean energy and ethics, and is sitting on a backlog of contracts worth tens of billions, including a $28 billion Intel chip campus in Ohio. The family still owns roughly 40% of the whole thing and runs a separate quiet investment empire on the side called the Fremont Group. No stock market, no quarterly earnings calls, no shareholders to answer to. 128 years, 5 generations, $23 billion a year, and still nobody can place the name. And maybe that's the real masterpiece here. Not the dam, not the desert city, not the pipeline. It's the fact that one family built the physical scaffolding of the modern world. The stuff you drive across and fly into and depend on every single day. And arrange things so completely that you'd never, ever know whose hands assembled it. The anonymity was always the asset. The work is just the proof. If stories about the families and empires that quietly run the world are what brought you here, subscribe to Global Status, and we'll keep delivering them. See you in the next one.